Welcome again to another episode of When They Say, You Say. I'm your hostess, Olivia Gans Turner, Director of American Victims of Abortion with the National Right to Life Committee. It's been a real pleasure spending the last couple of episodes with you, talking about new ways to think about answering old questions on the pro-life issue. There are so many things that so many of us are concerned about. I want to do a little tiny bit of a quick recap. The most important thing that we've been talking about for the first two episodes is the importance of really listening to the people that we're talking to. Really showing respect to the individuals that confront us with their perspective on anti-life, pro-life questions. Our position is always to be the voice of welcome and invitation, because from our point of view at the pro-life movement, particularly at National Right to Life, everyone's life is sacred, everyone's life is precious, every life deserves to be protected under the law. So our goal in communicating and talking, whether it's one-on-one or for those of you who may end up being involved in group leadership or participating in a Right to Life chapter or a church group at your level, you will be the voice and the face, not only of the movement, but more importantly, the voice and the face of unborn children and the vulnerable, as well as other lives that may hang in the balance. So it's important for us to remember that the way we look, the way we listen, the way we pay attention will determine the course of that conversation every bit as much as the words that we say. So, let's continue. Let's talk about what else we're going on to in this episode. Now, we covered a little bit about arguments 1 and 2, the idea that it's not a baby, it's a blob of tissue. We covered argument number 2, the idea that it's a woman's body, therefore it should always be her choice. And we discussed some of the reasons why those are really very common but fallacious arguments. In this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about another area, somewhat broader area, but actually one that I think many of us become nervous about because sometimes it involves different technical issues, different technical questions. And that is the argument number 3. Every child a wanted child, and all of the social arguments. That includes the idea of overpopulation, the idea of urban poverty, the idea of who's going to adopt all these babies, and problems that go a little bit beyond the immediate scope, things like, well, why don't you people support things like stem cell research? All of these sort of general social issues. So as we look at social issues, we all have to be aware of the fact that social issues sometimes create problems when it comes to making law. In fact, abortion is a very bad solution for virtually any social problem. The phenomenon that too often imposes itself on social problems is a kind of prejudice or fear from the sources of the people questioning. If we are not ourselves among those families who live with issues like poverty or perhaps other complications in our societies, or maybe other countries and other cultures where questions like overpopulation seem to be of great importance, we throw our anxieties and our fear at those situations and feel like, well, maybe the best thing to do is to provide more abortion in those situations. Well, the simple answer is, and this is, I admit, a rather simple answer, but it covers the concept. Killing poor children won't end poverty. Killing poor children here in the United States or abroad, in India, let's say, or Afghanistan, or China, or any part of the world where some of us are apprehensive about that experience. We also have to be prepared when we talk about these kinds of issues and when we hear variations of this every child a wanted child argument come up, we need to remember that there always are positive responses. There are responses that actually provide opportunities for everyone to benefit. As with argument number 2 and argument number 1, adoption remains one of those options that should always be presented in a positive light. The reality is that there may be legitimate reasons why this mother and this family can't at this time raise this child. And in those situations and settings, we need to have a more comprehensive and adaptive response to adoption. And that includes sometimes challenging our communities and our societies to make adoption more accessible or more understood or even more available, particularly in the cases of children who might be considered at risk or hard to adopt. So there's a lot of things like that that are going on that we don't think about sometimes when people ask us those questions. They don't know what we know. Common confusion about social issues is a real issue. One of the most extraordinarily lack of understanding is rampant in this one area of overpopulation. It's extraordinary to me how few people realize that the question of overpopulation is not really a question of numbers, but rather a question of development. In fact, I, in my work at National Right to Life, spent many, many years working at the United Nations as a member of our non-governmental organizational division. We have actually a liaison to the United Nations who's there at every UN conference. On several occasions, I was a part of that team. And I can tell you, after listening to the men and women who came to those conferences, particularly the World Conference, the UN Conference on Population and Development, the UN population, excuse me, the UN Conference on Women in 1995, and conferences like Habitat and food sources. All of these issues have been discussed at the United Nations. And every time I was at one of these conventions of the United Nations, I can tell you that we heard from the delegates from supposedly third world nations telling us that they did not appreciate the emphasis placed on eliminating the number of births in their country because developed nations felt that there may be simply too many of them to take care of. So overpopulation has never really been a question of numbers or population at all, but really an attitudinal problem based sometimes on our Western prejudices about developing countries and what they really need and what they really want. At the meantime, something that isn't also well known is that birth rates are dropping significantly and rapidly in the so-called developed world. Europe, America, Canada, Japan is in free fall when it comes to birth rates. This experience of declining birth rates is putting a great deal of pressure on many, many countries to deal with an ever-aging population. This phenomenon is something that is rarely discussed by the secular media, although very interestingly, only within the last year, including within the last week, have we seen certain sources, including CNBC and the New York Times, bring forward articles or editorials or commentary that actually, for the first time, in my recollection, acknowledge that this experience of declining birth rates is a significant issue and one that warrants attention. In fact, just within the last week, a CNBC editorialist made the commentary and a headline that said simply, "The world needs more babies." Well, that's our opinion at National Right to Life. We believe that the world is made better when we accept and welcome every child's birth, whether that child may be poor or that child lives in a country that by some standards seems too crowded or too busy. And in all cases, the challenge is really to us within our society to create more avenues of opportunity, support, and education or other tools that would benefit the individuals in question. So that's what you have to do when you talk to folks. Now, at this point in time, I think many of us are concerned about that question because somehow or other it seems to be affecting us. Well, again, listening to the people we talk to, we hear some of their anxieties. For many of us, as society ages, or as we deal with certain other aspects of life, we're seeing there are concerns about certain illness or certain types of disability, other questions that involve our health. And for many in our society now, there's this idea that somehow or other the idea of stem cells will solve all of our problems. Well, the National Right to Life Committee and the majority of the pro-life movement have never opposed the use of adult stem cells to provide legitimate and effective cures working on all kinds of spectrums in society and all ages. In fact, what is little known in this discussion of that problem is that at this point in time, as I speak to you on this episode, the total of cures, actual cures or effective treatments that have been put forward or developed with adult stem cell research is 73 to 0 embryonic stem cell research cures. In other words, to date, there have been no significant breakthroughs that point to any effective treatments using embryonic stem cells. Now, these are children who would otherwise die, but someone in science thinks the better course of action is to use these human beings, tiny though they are, as cures for the rest of us. Well, these are obviously people who when we talk to them in the general public who simply don't have access to this kind of information. Individuals like Dr. David Prentice, who's probably one of the nation's absolutely leading experts on the subject of adult versus embryonic stem cell research, really, out of sympathy and pity, says that most people simply don't know. There's a general level of ignorance and lack of understanding about all of these kinds of social issues, whichever one you talk about, that simply means it's up to us to bring forward more information. So when you find yourself challenged with these types of problems, it's a question of how is society failing to meet these challenges? And why do most of our folks and friends not know these things? Well, we all know the answer to that. Unfortunately, the mainstream media is not inclined to tell them the information that you will have when you research this stuff. NationalRightToLife.org or NRLC.org at our website, virtually all of these subjects that we're discussing today and have discussed throughout the series are covered in one way or another on our website. This is your opportunity to educate yourself. And while you educate yourself, you prepare better and better and better answers with more and more accurate information, so that while you're listening and you're smiling and you're ready to answer the questions, you will have the facts that you need. You never need to fear that. The facts are there. Your task is simply to prepare your answers. Now, at this point in time, I want to, on the series, I think it's important for me to remind you that these kinds of social issues and social questions, because they kind of mix, unfortunately, with a degree of anxiety or even social prejudice, it sometimes behooves us to stop and think and make sure that our own intentions are clear and fresh and clean, and our true goal is set always to put the value of each life, including the individuals we're talking to, at the highest of priorities. Now, I don't know about you, but I sometimes find myself getting anxious or worried when I find people talking to me about these things. When I hear people saying, well, the world is so overpopulated, I ask them, have they ever flown over the United States? I have. I've flown over the United States so many times I can't tell you. And you know, many of you actually watching this show have actually heard the phenomenon that I'm aware of, that you could take the entire population of the world and fit it into the state of Texas. According to the recent New York Times article I mentioned earlier, that is actually still the case. The Population Research Institute, led by Mr. Stephen Mosher, actually has verified this again and again and again. Their website is full of important information that guides you through this conversation. You can find out the answers. And if you stay with us after the break, I'll answer a few questions for you. Welcome back. I'm so glad that we're still talking together after the break now about these social issues that are under what we call argument number 3, every child a wanted child. I'm Olivia Gans, and I'm glad we're here together sharing this information again. I want to bring it back up to a thought that I had during the break. I think one of the saddest elements of this kind of argumentation, where people make the idea, put the idea forward rather, that perhaps the best thing we can do about the number of poor women having children in poverty that will probably all end up in crime or abusive situations, is the assumption, really rather callously, that a woman who might be herself poor doesn't want her child. And there's a kind of callous cruelty in that thought process that I don't think sometimes the people that approach us with that mentality when they challenge us have even thought about. It's a rather pejorative, patronizing attitude that because a woman is poor, she clearly couldn't want her child to be born into the same situation. What that woman really is usually looking for is some degree of respect to her that will help her to realize that she and her child, or a young family, say it's a young couple living in that situation, will be able to live their lives with a degree of dignity and respect that currently is missing. Sending this woman home after an abortion does not end the situation of poverty that she's living in. Sending a woman home after having an abortion because she's too poor to afford this child is simply a continuation of her bag of problems. She's still poor the night after she comes home after the abortion. But now she has to live with the memory of a child that no one was prepared to help her bring into this world. there is an ugliness to that that I think sometimes the individuals who challenge us and question us haven't pondered. And while I want you to be kind and careful in how you approach this conversation when something like that comes forward, you need to remember that is definitely sometimes behind this, and no one even realizes that they're saying it. So this is something for all of us to be aware of. Now, as I said before the break, we're going to talk a little bit now about some of the tough questions that come under this category. We've been talking about it throughout the episode, but I'm going to break them down a little bit. Among the questions that many of you have heard and sent to us that we are trying to respond to here, let me bring to your attention one that I think we've just started on that I think is the most common, and that is,
what are we going to do with all these children? These children are all going to end up in poverty. Every child should be wanted, and these children are clearly not wanted.
well, the question has to be very simply put, who doesn't want them? The assumption that because the child's parents may not be able to parent that child doesn't necessarily follow that there are no people anywhere who want this baby. In fact, anyone who watches the show and is involved with the area of adoption, whether here at home in the United States or has been involved in international adoption situations, realizes that there are children and families throughout the world waiting to be connected. One of my dearest friends in the whole world is a beautiful young woman who recently was able to adopt a little child from a Central European country, a little child who, by some standards, would be thought of as less than perfect in some people's eyes. And yet this little girl's smile and her laughter and the joy she brings all of us when she visits with us at convention time or meeting time is absolutely, unmistakably a miracle of the plan that sometimes we are not aware of, but is eternally present for each of us. And this is what we don't know when we say the best thing we can do in this situation is help this woman have an abortion. We are completely cutting off the possibilities for how life can be preserved and protected under sources. It's another little challenge we often get. Another question.
We all know these children are going to end up in poverty and crime. We know that we are going to end up paying for their mistakes because they are mistakes. Why in the world would we continue to support this type of incredible waste of life?
Well, the question there being put is, really, seriously? You want to actually suggest that children born into, let's say, the slums are less valuable simply because of where they're being born? If that doesn't sound prejudice to you, it ought to. And we need to call people on that and challenge them. The next big question that always comes up is,
how can the world continue to support more people? We are running out of resources everywhere.
well, an interesting article that I read recently pointed out that it actually is the presence of people on the planet that actually creates new answers that we're looking for. Ideas like desalination of the oceans, ideas like how to irrigate deserts, ideas that really allow us, including things like terrace farming. All of this creative energy comes from the people living. People living in our communities and in our societies, needing to find answers because there are so many people that need these responses, that allows this creativity to form. So we're actually cutting off our ability to be creative when we say there's too many of us and we need to eliminate some of them. As I said earlier in the program, the graying of Europe is a huge problem. Recently, world leaders like Pope Benedict spoke extensively about this problem, that families in Europe needed to consider quickly having children, because it is children that keep a culture alive. And this is our phenomenon now in this society. Throughout the world, we're seeing this death of cultures. So it's time for us to stop believing the mythology and actually pursue responses that are life-giving and life-preserving. And finally,
why don't you support stem cell research?
we do. We support ethical stem cell research, ethical adult stem cell research that is truly providing life-giving cures. 73 to 100 is the excuse me, pardon me, 73 to 0 is the score in favor of adult stem cells. There are really life-giving answers in the world of science that don't involve killing someone in order to save a life. That's our goal, to work creatively and realistically within the law to make things possible for all of the individuals in question. This is your challenge, to study, to learn, to go to nrlc.org, National Right to Life Committee's website, to go to the Population Research Institute. Discover for yourselves what isn't true about the myths you've been told, and what is true about the needs our world has to protect and preserve innocent human life. In my experience, there's nothing quite like listening to the honesty of an individual who comes from one of those countries where organizations like International Planned Parenthood have been plying their evil and deadly trade for many years now, and hear their disdain and disgust for the West, us, America in particular, for promoting and advocating the advancement of these pro-abortion programs that are decimating their communities. This is not an answer that respects other cultures or other individuals. These are answers that deprive all of us of the lives that are created for joy, created with hopefulness in mind. Now, you and I have a lot of work to do. Learning about options, learning about the information that's out there on adoption, on stem cell research, on world population. You can do it. You don't have to worry too much. What you really have to know is that none of us needs to be the perfect expert. This is something else. When I talk about this issue, there's sometimes an anxiety factor when we're talking about when they say, you say. My colleague, Mary Balch, who is a very brilliant attorney in my estimation, Mary is quick to point out that there is sometimes this anxiety factor that we all have to be absolute experts, like Dr. Dave Prentice, or any one of us who we know, the great speakers and leaders of our movement at this day and age, people like Doug Johnson, so many others who really know these subjects so well, they eat, breathe, and sleep them. Well, you don't have time to do that. You're a mother, you're a husband, you're going to work, you're teaching school, you're doing all the things that you do, you're a priest in your parish. There are so many of us, you're a pastor, you're doing things all the time that take you away from studying. What I need all of you to know is that if you don't know the answer, learn where the answers are. Pay attention to the information sources that the pro-life movement has been organizing and developing for many years now. And don't be afraid to say, I don't know if I can answer all of your questions, but may I refer you to these organizations. You can do this, and you can make it easier for the people you're talking to. Finally, when somebody says to you,
who will care for all of the babies you want to be born?
remember this. Most of the time, the people who are pregnant, the mothers facing this life and death decision, would prefer to care for their own babies. And if we connect the dots for this mother, for this young couple, for this family, to the help that you and I know the pro-life movement provides every day to women all across the United States and in other countries outside of the United States, that question would be moot. Because most of us, the mothers of these children, want to hold and caress and raise our own children, whether we're here in the United States or in Central Africa. We all want the same thing, life-affirming responses to real personal and social issues. Don't be afraid to challenge the people that talk to you about these things. Most of the time, it's not cruelty or ugliness that drives them. It's simply ignorance, lack of information, and lack of opportunity to be challenged to think it through. When you're talking to people, remember that you may be the first pro-lifer they've ever spoken to. So when we're talking about babies and mother helping centers and opportunities that are life-giving and life-affirming, like adult stem cell research or adoption services that are expanded every day, or the value of a developed society versus one that's shut down due to low birth rate or any other problem, you're expanding people's horizons. And you're breaking stereotypes. because you're not what they expect. That's pretty exciting. I find it exciting. I want you to think about that. Breaking stereotypes is something that, to me, comes easily. I think the biggest thing that sometimes breaks a stereotype on pro-life debates and pro-life issues is, number one, sometimes that I'm a woman. We all know there's prejudices about that. But number two, it's understanding that issues like this, and issues that basically simply tell the truth about the development of the unborn child, are issues that allow you to put your best face forward, to actually create an environment that's healthy and whole and holistic when it comes to life. Can't wait to see you on our next episode of When They Say, You Say.